My whole life I've been a fraud. I'm not exaggerating. Pretty much all I've ever done all the time is try to create a certain impression of me in other people, mostly to be liked or admired. It's a little more complicated than that, maybe. But when you come right down to it, it's to be liked, loved, admired, approved of, applauded, whatever. You get the idea. I did well in school, but deep down the whole thing's motive wasn't to learn or improve myself, but just to do well. To get good grades, make sports teams, and perform well. To have a good transcript or varsity letters to show people. I didn't enjoy it much because I was always scared I wouldn't do well enough. The fear made me work really hard, so I'd always do well and end up getting what I wanted. But then once I got the best grade or made all city, or got Angela Meade to let me put my hand on her breast, I wouldn't feel much of anything, except maybe fear that I wouldn't be able to get it again, the next time or next thing I wanted. I remember being down in the rec room in Angela Meade's basement on the couch and having her let me get my hand up under her blouse, and not even really feeling the soft aliveness or whatever of her breast, because all I was doing was thinking, now I'm the guy that Meade let get to second with her. Later that seemed so sad. This was in middle school. She was a very big-hearted, quiet, self-contained, thoughtful girl. She's a veterinarian now, with her own practice. And I never even really saw her. I couldn't see anything except who I might be in her eyes. This cheerleader and probably number 2 or 3 among the most desirable girls in middle school that year. She was much more than that. She was beyond all that adolescent ranking and popularity crap, but I never really let her be or saw her as more, although I put up a very good front as somebody who could have deep conversations and really wanted to know and understand who she was inside. Later I was in analysis. I tried analysis like almost everybody else then in their late 20s who'd made some money or had a family or whatever they thought they wanted and still didn't feel that they were happy. A lot of people I knew tried it. It didn't really work, although it did make everyone sound more aware of their own problems and added some useful vocabulary and concepts to the way we all had to talk to each other to fit in and sound a certain way. You know what I mean. I was in regional advertising at the time in Chicago, having made the jump from media buyer for a large consulting firm, and at only 29 I'd made creative associate. And verily, as they say, I was a fair-haired boy and on the fast track, but wasn't happy at all, whatever happy means. But of course I didn't say this to anybody because it was such a cliche. Tears of a clown, Richard Cory, etc. And the circle of people who seemed important to me seemed much more dry, oblique, and contemptuous of cliches than that. And so, of course, I spent all my time trying to get them to think I was dry and jaded as well, doing things like yawning and looking at my nails and saying things like, am I happy is one of those questions that, if it has got to be asked, more or less dictates its own answer, etc. Putting in all this time and energy to create a certain impression and get approval or acceptance that then I felt nothing about, because it didn't have anything to do with who I really was inside. And I was disgusted with myself for always being such a fraud, but I couldn't seem to help it. Here are some of the various things I tried. EST, riding a 10-speed to Nova Scotia and back, hypnosis, cocaine, sacrocervical chiropractic, joining a charismatic church, jogging, pro bono work for the ad council, meditation classes, the Masons, analysis, the Landmark Forum, the Course in Miracles, a right brain drawing workshop, celibacy, collecting and restoring vintage Corvettes, and trying to sleep with a different girl every night for 2 straight months. I racked up a total of 36 for 61, and also got chlamydia, which I told friends about, acting like I was embarrassed, but secretly expecting most of them to be impressed, which, under the cover of making a lot of jokes at my expense, I think they were. But for the most part, the 2 months just made me feel shallow and predatory. Plus, I missed a great deal of sleep and was a wreck at work. That was also the period I tried cocaine. I know this part is boring, and probably boring you, by the way, but it gets a lot more interesting when I get to the part where I kill myself and discover what happens immediately after a person dies. In terms of the list, psychoanalysis was pretty much the last thing I tried. The analyst I saw was okay. A big, soft older guy with a big ginger mustache and a pleasant, sort of informal manner. I'm not sure I remember him alive too well. He was a fairly good listener and seemed interested and sympathetic in a slightly distant way. At first I suspected he didn't like me or was uneasy around me. I don't think he was used to patients who were already aware of what their real problem was. He was also a bit of a pill pusher. I balked at trying antidepressants. I just couldn't see myself taking pills to try to be less of a fraud. I said that even if they worked, how would I know if it was me or the pills? By that time, I had already knew I was a fraud. I knew what my problem was. I just couldn't seem to stop. I remember I spent maybe the first 20 times or so in analysis acting all open and candid, but in reality sort of fencing with him, or leading him around by the nose, basically showing him that I wasn't just another one of those patients who stumbled in with no clue what their real problem was, or who were totally out of touch with the truth about themselves. When you come right down to it, I was trying to show him that I was at least as smart as he was, and that there wasn't much of anything he was going to see about me that I hadn't already seen and figured out. And yet I wanted help, and really was there to try to get help. I didn't even tell him how unhappy I was until 5 or 6 months into the analysis, mostly because I didn't want to seem like just another whining, self-absorbed yuppie, even though I think, even then, I was on some level conscious that that's all I really was, deep down. Right from the start, what I liked best about the analyst was that his office was a mess. There were books and papers every place, and usually he had to clear things off the chair so I could sit down. There was no couch. I sat in an easy chair, and he sat facing me in his beat-up old desk chair, whose back part had one of those big rectangles or capes of back massage beads attached to it, the same way cabbies often put them on their seat in the cab. This was another thing I liked, the desk chair and the fact that it was a little too small for him, and he was not a small guy, so that he had to sit sort of almost hunched with his feet flat on the floor, or else sometimes he'd put his hands behind his head and lean way back in the chair in a way that made the back portion squeak terribly when it leaned back. There always seemed to be something patronizing or a little condescending about somebody crossing their legs when they talked to you, and the desk chair didn't allow him to do this. If he ever crossed his legs, his knee would have been up around his chin. And yet he had apparently never gone out and gotten himself a bigger or nicer desk chair, or even bothered to oil the medial joint springs to keep the back from squeaking, a noise that I know would have driven me up the wall if it had been my chair, and I had to spend all day in it. I noticed all this almost right away. The little office also reeked of pipe tobacco, which is a pleasant smell. Plus, Dr. Gustafsson never took notes or answered everything with a question, or any of the cliché analyst things that would have made the whole thing too horrible to keep going back, whether it even helped or not. The whole effect was a sort of likable, disorganized, laid-back guy, and things in there actually did get better after I realized that he probably wasn't going to do anything to make me quit fencing with him and trying to anticipate all his questions so I could show that I already knew the answer. He was going to get his $65 either way, and finally came out and told him about being a fraud and feeling alienated. I had to use the uptown word, of course, but it was still the truth, and starting to see myself ending up living this way for the rest of my life and being completely unhappy. I told him I wasn't blaming anybody for my being a fraud. I had been adopted, but it was as a baby, and the step-parents who adopted me were better and nicer than most of the biological parents I knew anything about. And I was never yelled at, or abused, or pressured to hit 400 in Legion Ball, or anything. And they took out a second mortgage to send me to an elite college when I could have gone scholarship to UW Eau Claire, etc. Nobody had ever done anything bad to me. Every problem I ever had, I'd been the cause of. I was a fraud, and the fact that I was lonely was my own fault. Of course his ears pricked up at fault, which is a loaded term, because I seemed to be so totally self-centered and fraudulent that I experienced everything in terms of how it affected people's view of me and what I needed to do to create the impression of me I wanted them to have. I said I knew what my problem was. What I couldn't do was stop it. I also admitted to Dr. Gustafsson some of the ways I'd been jerking him around early on and trying to make sure he saw me as smart and self-aware, and said I'd known early on that playing around and showing off an analysis were a waste of time and money, but that I couldn't seem to help myself. It just happened automatically. He smiled at all this, which was the first time I remember seeing him smile. I don't mean he was sour or humorless. He had a big red friendly face and a pleasant enough manner, but this was the first time he'd smiled like a human being having an actual conversation. And yet at the same time, I already saw what I'd left myself open for, and sure enough, he says it. "If I understand you right," he says, "you're saying that you're basically a calculating, manipulative person who always says what you think will get somebody to approve of you or form some impression of you think you want." I told him that was maybe a little simplistic, but basically accurate. And he said further that as he understood it, I was saying that I felt as if I was trapped in this false way of being and unable ever to be totally open and tell the truth, irregardless of whether it made me look good in others' eyes or not. And I somewhat resignedly said yes. and that I seemed always to have had this fraudulent, calculating part of my brain firing away all the time, as if I were constantly playing chess with everybody and figuring out that if I wanted them to move a certain way, I had to move in such a way as to induce them to move that way. He asked if I ever played chess, and I told him that I used to in middle school, but quit, because I couldn't be as good as I eventually wanted to be. How frustrating it was to get just good enough to know what getting really good at it would be like, but not being able to get that good, etc. I was laying it on sort of thick in hopes of distracting him from the big insight and question I realized I'd set myself up for, but it didn't work. He leaned back in his loud chair and paused as if he were thinking hard for effect. He was thinking that he was going to get to feel like he'd really earned his $65 today. Part of the pause always involved stroking his mustache in an unconscious way. I was reasonably sure that he was going to say something like, "So then how were you able to do what you just did a moment ago?" In other words, meaning how was I able to be honest about the fraudulence if I was really a fraud, meaning he thought he'd caught me in some kind of logical contradiction or paradox. And I went ahead and played a little dumb, probably, to get him to go ahead and say it, partly because I still held out some hope that what he'd say might be more discerning or incisive than I had predicted. But it was also partly because I liked him, and liked the way he seemed genuinely pleased and excited at the idea of being helpful, but was trying to exercise professional control over his facial expression in order to make the excitement look more like simple pleasantness and clinical interest in my case or whatever. He was hard not to like. He had what is known as an engaging manner. By way of decor, the office wall behind the chair had 2 framed prints, one being that Wyeth one of the little girl in the wheat field crawling uphill towards the farmhouse. The other a still life of 2 apples in a bowl on a table by Cézanne. To be honest, I only knew it was Cézanne because it was an Art Institute poster and had a banner with info on a Cézanne show underneath the painting, which was a still life, and which was weirdly discomfiting because there was something slightly off about the perspective or style that made the table look crooked and the apples look almost square. The prints were obviously there to give the analyst patients something to look at, since many people like to look around or look at things on the wall while they talk. I didn't have any trouble looking right at him most of the time I was in there, though. He did have a talent for putting you at ease, there was no question about it. But I had no illusions that this was the same as having enough insight or firepower to find some way to really help me, though. There was a basic logical paradox that I called the fraudulence paradox, that I had discovered more or less on my own while taking a mathematical logic course in school. I remember this as being a huge undergrad lecture course that met twice a week in an auditorium with the professor up on stage, and on Fridays in smaller discussion sections led by a graduate assistant whose whole life seemed to be mathematical logic. Plus, all you had to do to ace the class was sit down with the assigned textbook that the prof was the editor of and memorize the different modes of argument and normal forms and axioms of first-order quantification. Meaning the course was as clean and mechanical as logic itself, in that if you put in the time and effort, out popped the good grade at the other end. We only got to paradoxes like the Berry and Russell paradoxes and the incompleteness theorem at the very end of the term. They weren't on the final.
Tender Supper's on the stove, but it's the light in your eyes that makes it warm. Hey, it's good to be back home again. Sometimes this old farm feels like a long lost friend. Hey, it's good to be back home again. There's all the news to tell him. How'd you spend your time? What's the latest thing the neighbors say? Your mother called last Friday. The sunshine made her cry. You felt the baby move just yesterday. Hey, it's good to be back home again. Sometimes this old farm feels like a long lost friend. Hey, it's good to be back home again. All the time that I can lay this tired old body down. Feel your fingers feather soft upon me. Kisses